Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Mediaworks Digital Roundtable. Feels a little different, actually, from the normal stand-up masterclasses that I do, but really looking forward to doing a bit more of a deep dive into a real sector that we have a lot of focus in across Mediaworks, which is housing. I think a large proportion of what we're going to talk about today is really around sort of how technology and communication shape tenant satisfaction. I think it's fair to say that since sort of the white paper that we launched, so grab a copy. If it hasn't been sent to you, we can more than happy to send it out. I like that, Paul, doing a bit of selling. The white paper was launched last month, and we will be updating the information and results based on the latest TSMs that were presented on the 4th of November. But for us today is really about talking through that combination around the information that we took from the TSMs that were introduced by the government in 2023 and MediaWorks' own proprietary measures of digital experience performance. So I think we're going to cover a range of trends. We're then going to deep dive into sort of some of the measures that we're looking at and some of the key call outs there. And ultimately, we hope to give people actionable insight that they can take away or want to go and look a bit further into. My name's David Norris. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at MediaWorks. I'm hosting today's roundtable. But with me, I've also got Dan and Paul. So Dan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan, CTO here at MediaWorks.
And I'm Paul, Managing Partner. I look after the strategy and insight teams here at MediaWorks.
So as we will go through today's session, we really do intend it to be really quite conversational. And look, it will follow a similar pattern to what's in our white paper that we produced. I think the big thing is when we've looked at sort of the top 6 housing trends from our perspective, I think the key that we've highlighted really is that technology and communication are real drivers of tenant satisfaction. And that's really what we're going to do a bit of a deep dive into, looking across things like, we've pulled out 6 key trends, so things like smart maintenance and compliance, digital tenant engagement platforms, what they mean, what does best in class in that area look like. Obviously, most people will be talking about automation and cloud-first services, particularly around things like AI and the role that AI and data is playing into that piece. Inclusion through accessible design. Again, we actually delivered a session a few months ago on accessible design, what that means and the requirement to actually engage with different audiences, particularly in the housing space where we're dealing with such diverse groups. I think that's a really important element. Data-driven energy and retrofit, again, as part of that, how does that actually work? How do you become more efficient in those areas? And then obviously things like trust through data security. I think, Dan, I know you and I have talked many a time about data security and what that means in a digital first world, yeah, and how that actually influences. So for me, I think all of these 6 sort of key themes are areas that we do cover within the white paper. So I guess then to sort of siphon that down, distill that down even further, tenant engagement, I think, is really important when we look at sort of the TSMs and the outcomes of that, where we've seen 70% average overall from a satisfaction perspective. I think 60% of tenants are feeling listened to. 70% feel they are kept informed, which again is relatively positive. 50% of landlords, though, sit below these benchmarks, looking at a median rate. And I think, again, just to highlight sort of some of the things that we drew out, like looking at things like digital transformation, accessible platforms, sort of multi-channel communication, so not just being reliant upon tried and tested methods. People are getting more disparate in the way that they engage with content, whether that be through things like LLMs, etc. now in terms of how do we consume information. What do feedback loops look like? Again, like how quick can we do that? How efficiently and effectively can we do that? And then obviously from our perspective, automated compliance. Is there anything you'd like to?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty clear from looking at the TSMs how important this area is, and I think for people who aren't involved in the kind of housing sector, they probably think that most of our lives are going to be concerned with the management of the fabric of the buildings and maintenance, those kind of things, which are all really important. But obviously, these measures about engagement are really, really important. And I think that although 70% does look pretty good, there's obviously, quite a lot of room for improvement. And, a lot of the solutions to this do rely on kind of technology, but underlying it is a kind of mindset shift about, it's about reliability, it's about communication, it's about trust. and that needs to be established between the housing provider and their customers. I think for me the really interesting thing here is that this is a world of self-service portals, mobile apps, chatbots, like David said, AI, tools, that kind of thing. And why are we talking about that? Well, it's because it's become very familiar for your customers. They're accessing the many different services, from buying a bus ticket to many Deliveroo, whatever it's going to be. And there's an expectation about how digital services work, and how you can create feedback loops within them. And you just need to think that is applying equally to the world of our tenants and customers as it is within these kind of tech startups and all the rest of it. The bar has been set, and we need to kind of work out how, by reaching that bar, we can actually improve our scores on these kind of things.
Yeah, and I think it's important, isn't it? Because I think the Social Housing Regulation Act sort of put tenant voice at the centre of all elements of compliance. And I think for us, it's about how do you effectively engage with tenants over a period of time to drive those performance measures, really, and drive that understanding up. I think it's like it has gone from like an obligation point to a differentiation piece that I think is really important.
Well, that takes you nicely onto the next point.
Yeah, nudging me along.
Well, no, I think because like you say, it's moving from obligation to differentiation. So it might be, it's about compliance, it's about reporting, but it's not just about ticking a box. It's about how you're going to tick that box. Are you going to have satisfied tenants? Because not just saying, oh yeah, my accommodation's okay, but they need to be feeling listened to. They need to feel they've got a voice, and you need to be communicating effectively to them. And I think that this point about from obligation to differentiation. A lot of the work that I've done within, our housing clients this year has been about differentiation. It's been about why it's important to have a brand that has values and has meaning, and that goes into how you're going to treat your customers, how you're going to communicate with them, how you're going to be there for them, and that feeds into a load of different stuff about accessibility, multi-channel communication, and kind of creating feedback loops, like we said. And when it comes to compliance, a lot of this can then be automated. So great front end systems go into great back end systems, and we can be more effectively tracking, the tenant customer satisfaction.
I think for me, there's two parts to that, and I think it's maybe two different realities between some of the automation and the reporting, like TSM, versus the lived experience of a tenant. I think it is a sector where the tenant centricity is massive, but it's understanding what metrics or what methods and tactics around things like Paul mentioned around communication that are really going to change perception. And I think that's again a key area where digital can play a big part in transforming that.
So again, Dan, you've teamed me up perfectly there around sort of how important that digital transformation piece is. We've talked about it so many times, and look, people have been no doubt screaming through the laptops or TV screens or wherever they're consuming this, but it's like, they'll be like, well, we're a digital agency, we're going to say digital transformation is important. But I think for us, going back to sort of tenant centricity, for us, it's about sort of customers more widely. And we know that sort of digital consumption, and to go back to Paul's point, the previous slide is consumers' expectations around digital and how we engage with different content is so important now, isn't it? Because we do live in very much digital first era.
100%. I think there's probably a part here where it's less about innovation, it's more about catching up and more about going back to simplicity and making sure that tenants get the best experience they can through the digital channels. I think there's areas where legacy channels, things like phone calls actually gave a better level of service. So the tenant's priority is to go back to the phone. But actually in all other sectors, things like banking or have you, that they're used to being able to be updated, have real-time insights. I think that's the area that, a lot of different associations and local authorities are having to look at in terms of this digital transformation piece. And how do you level that playing field so that all associations and all local authorities can give a similar level of experience?
And I think the good news is that while we're talking about legacy systems creating friction, the ability to now look at more forward-thinking solutions that are kind of based in the cloud and that kind of thing is very accessible to everyone now. So there's really no reason why this isn't a very good time to think about, using technology to kind of get on top of some of these issues.
Yeah, and I think that for me, again, Paul, leads me nicely onto sort of concept of M-MeX. I think, like, obviously with sort of tenant satisfaction measures, etc., coming into place, and that gives us very much a customer profile, a customer view of how each of the housing association, housing providers, organisations are performing from a tenant perspective. But I think what we were really keen to do as an organisation is, again, looking at more broadly across sort of the digital landscape and really having that outside-in look at things as well. So we produced a sort of M-MeX, which for us, for those that don't know, it is very much a digital benchmark for customer experience. It's not just something we do across the housing sector. It is things that we've rolled out across other sectors, such as utilities, water, etc., which I think is really important. But ultimately, it is an opportunity to understand sort of a digital maturity and where you sit against your peer set. And I think that's the really interesting point around M-MeX, and where we've definitely had a lot of conversations with sort of clients, prospects, etc., partners, looking to see sort of how we actually can level up against the competition, how we are performing relative to people that we see as our peers in this space. And I think that provides us a useful framework on which we can hold those conversations. We're going to go through each of the 6 metrics, if you like, for each of the relevant areas and M-MeX as we go through the rest of today's session. But I think for me, it's such an important piece that, if anybody does want to find out anything more about M-MeX, does want to find out how they're currently benchmark and performing against the industry, against peer sets, etc., then please do drop notes into the chat, fill out the form, and we'll more than happily come and give you a tailored approach towards your own M-MeX activity.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is that notion of experience, I think, often got bucketed as a thing, but in reality, experience is all the way through the end-to-end experience of a tenant or a user. So it's understanding how all of these parts play into that overall perception. And I think, we've seen strong correlation between when we go through the sector-specific metrics and all of the data points within M-MeX that really align to showcase how digital capability does play a huge part in how people respond and perceive brands.
Yeah, and I think what I would be saying is, I think just to finish this, I think there's obviously six measures, one being very sector specific. For this, obviously TSM plays a massive part of that. And then obviously what we've done is we've utilised another 5 metrics from which we're, as I say, often asked about from our clients, our partners out there, that we've bucketed into a range of areas. And again, there's multiple measures, there's multiple data points feeding each of these measures. So it's not a singular point of data point. But I think it's really important that we go through that in a bit more depth and talk about, again, why all of this matters, what it actually yields. So I guess when you jump into sector-specific information, Paul, do you want to talk through the sector-specific?
So, as David just said, it's all very well as having these kind of customer experience benchmarks, which are largely digital. Obviously, the key metrics are around TSM, and those are the ones that you guys are being audited on, judged on, you need to report on. So we need to have a data point that we can see whether the other data points are having a positive impact on that for you. So that's why we pick a sector-specific one. So we've picked 3 of the measures that are part of TSM. So TPO1, overall satisfaction, TPO6, are you listening to your tenants, and TPO7, are you speaking to your tenants? Can I just make one really interesting point? One of the big projects I did with a housing provider this year, day 1, meeting 2 was about what the hell do we call our tenant, customer, user, service user, end user. And part of a really important thing that they did was to say, we're going to call them customers,
right?
Because it refocuses the relationship. So from landlord tenant to, they're a customer of ours. So that's why this is all, we totally buy into this whole approach, and it is about how that relationship is really working. And what we can see here, we can see that, and we'll follow this pattern through as we go through each slides. We see the blue is our leading person that we've reviewed as part of the study, and we have reviewed hundreds
Is it hundreds? Thousands?
Thousands. There you go. We can see Stockport Metropolitan Borough Council, leading on the TSM data that we've got. But in the pink, we can see we pulled out the lowest performing housing provider on our list, and we can see that they're doing pretty badly. I think as we go through these, it's now a matter of looking at the shape of these graphs and saying, do these data points kind of correlate to each other? If you're strong in one area, will it mean that you're doing better in another area? But what you can see is that Stockport are doing relatively okay on all their other ones, and we'll come to later on about technical, but that's the one that they're scoring poorly on.
Yeah, but I think that's it. I think when you understand that Stockport is scoring the strongest on TSM in the last results, that all of those other metrics align, and you can see that actually that they're across the board trying to have a level of digital maturity that supports the tenants. So I think it'd be interesting as we go through the rest to understand like what the metrics are and what kind of activities or different campaigns people could do throughout to drive up their kind of scoring with their tenants.
Yeah, so I think when the next area that we'll look at is brand. So I think we often talk about brand as a digital agency, and I think for us it falls back on sort of how the organisation's digital presence and communication activity sort of distills an element of trust, recognition and reliability across search and also sort of review platforms. Again, it's something that we've been talking to multiple clients, regardless of whether you're in housing or whether you're in retail. We talk to clients quite often about brand and the role it plays across their organisation and the impact that it actually has. So we're well versed in a range of the metrics that exist.
Yeah, and I think this, for me, this is really interesting. This one, so Birmingham City Council are coming out top on brand. This is about one of the metrics here is that we're looking at is the number of brand searches. So people are looking a lot for Birmingham City Council. Now you've got to ask yourself the question that if they've got high brand visibility, why is their TSM so low? Well, Birmingham City Council have definitely been having an interesting year for many different reasons. And, what it could be is reflecting that there's a high level of people wanting to engage with them, ask them questions, resolve problems. They're being highly, followed within social media. The city council, the second biggest city in the UK. So, of course, they've got authority. But because of different aspects of what's been going on in Birmingham City Council this year, that hasn't translated through into a high TSM. And you can see in the middle, our lowest performing, once you really start getting down into the low scores on some of the other areas, your brand visibility will just be very low because you're just simply not there. You're not present. People aren't looking for you, and people aren't kind of talking about you.
And again, Dan, there's online review metrics a part of this as well, are there?
Yes, I think throughout we kind of look at how well they're performing. I think particularly in brand, I would say that there's an area there where it's probably more about, okay, how are people interacting with that brand and how people like searching for that brand. And I think going back to Paul's point there, I think there's an area there where it's more about actually, this might be a metric that says people are searching for you or people are trying to find you, but not necessarily with both positive sentiment. It could be negative sentiment. Exactly. And that's kind of where we drive through to say, okay, well, how does that flow through to the other metrics?
Yep.
Then sort of on the heels of brand, we talk about reach. So reach for us is a really, again, an interesting metric. So I think for us, it's about sort of, again, how effectively does the organisation's sort of digital and social activity expand visibility and audience connection across a range of relevant marketing channels, I think is the interesting one. So with a particular focus on things like social here.
Yeah, and we can see here North Yorkshire Council, and we're not biased. It's very, very close to us. But they're doing great, and you can see they're doing great on 4 out of the 6 metrics. So I think that, there'd be a very interesting conversation we'd like to have with North Yorkshire Council, which is saying you've got a visibility, you've got authority, you've got reach. We're talking reach here is about, how visible you are, but how people are engaging within social channels as well. So you're doing a lot of things right. So, why isn't that translating into the other two data points? And again, if you don't have reach, if you haven't got engagement, then it's very hard to affect some of the other metrics. And, so we would say that, again, all of these tied together, and reach being a key one of showing you, well, how effective, if you do have something new to say, or you're doing something good that you were doing poorly before, how are you going to let people know? And that's a good match. This one,
I think that's it. It's what is the strategy where you might have followers, you might be using the channels, but what's the communication plan there? How are you putting out the kind of the key messages that you want to get to tenants, rather than it necessarily being a channel that might be used for more negative sentiment again. So again, it's really deep diving into that on an individual basis when we look at the M-MeX scores individually to understand, okay, what are the challenges that each organisation has?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, actually, Dan, because I think that anytime you do anything where you present league tables, I've been involved in, for example, higher education, and there's many papers written out there about the gamification of league table positions, etc., across universities. Really interesting space to consider. But I think actually, for an organisation that is looking at their M-MeX score, it actually is, isn't it? It's the spark of a conversation, it's the start of a conversation, and then it's about a deep dive into, right, well, what is actually going on in this space, and therefore what are the strategies that are going to drive improved performance. I think it's such an important
And
piece.
I think the next one is a really interesting one for that.
Yeah.
So
you're teaming me up, aren't you? You're nudging me along, Paul. Yeah, it's absolutely perfect. So authority.
Right. So I think this is dead interesting. So North Yorkshire Council, great. You're doing well here. You are an established organisation. I know that you kind of had a name change a couple of years ago from the county council to the council, but you probably retained a lot of your kind of digital authority, like people linking to you, and all of that is great. Then our lowest performing one has basically got almost zero authority, but has got a high TSM and a high brand. Now, what would be interesting is to say, is this someone new? So if you're new to the market and you've got a great brand and you've got quite a small tenant base and you haven't got a big legacy, then you can quite easily see a world where your TSM will be good and your brand scores are also good. The problem with the lack of authority is, as you mature over time, then and your organisation starts to have longevity, you want to see that authority score increasing, because that is a metric of, are you gaining a kind of centre of gravity? Are you building, what people think about you by having increased authority? And when we're talking authority, it's all about people linking to you. Yeah. So that to me looks like it could be a new entrant.
Yeah, and I think, Dan, this is a really important piece, isn't it, around the future of search, if you like, just generally, because authority plays such an important role in large language models, etc., whether that's ChatGPT, whether it be Gemini, etc. Like, I think we're seeing that. I mean, I was literally delivering a masterclass last week looking at the future of search, and we were talking about the role that authority plays as part of that.
Massively. I think, links and getting backlinks and referring domains coming in has always been a core pillar for SEO. I think fundamentally things like citations are becoming more of a focus with things like AI-driven discovery. It is all about the consensus and being found on a continuous basis around kind of your strength points. And I think that all ties back into this whole notion around comms and getting the right message out. Is how can you use this to be echoed, not just within your owned estate, but how do you get it to be within the earned estate as well? And I think that's a big part of the authority piece is pushing out that kind of notion of credibility, and it ties back to all the points Paul made at the beginning about tying that back to how a tenant views an organisation.
Yeah, trust. I mean, we talked about trust at the beginning.
Yeah,
these authority scores are a big factor in building trust, because people, not only does Google and ChatGPT have that digital trust metric, it means that people are reading about you, discovering you in more places, because you will have effective digital PR going out and you'll be being talked about in more different places. So this authority bit, it feels, it's authority, but authority builds trust.
I think that's the big part. I think, in other sectors, authority and credibility will play a part in whether people choose to interact with you as a brand. I think in the housing space, we know how big the waiting list is for social housing. I think this is more about making sure we give the tenants the best experience. And actually what we're looking at here is, okay, are you being talked about in the right way? Like, are you being seen as a good provider in the market? And that's what we want to be looking at and understanding, okay, how do we shape that? And how do we push out all of the good stuff that the organizations are doing, from tenant boards all the way through to kind of local events and community engagement and stuff, and just make sure that's being seen.
Yeah, and I think that personalization piece that we often talk about that cuts through, and I know we talk about throughout this white paper, like people are expecting like more personalized experiences, more tailored experiences, and we are seeing sort of, this whole element of authority really impacting that personalization piece around the information which I might be served versus the information you might be served when making those searches.
Definitely from a digital point of view, but then there's also authority from like kind of outside of pure like kind of digital experiences. And I think that's a big part. As I say, community is the heart of a lot of the kind of things within the tenant's kind of mind. I think it's making sure that is forefront. When people are evaluating perceiving brands, are they seeing a lot about one organization doing a lot within their community? Like that, that is something we need to make sure is prevalent in all of the kind of strategies in terms of authority and just general kind of outreach.
Yep.
So then onto technical, I think like again some of the key measures there are things around sort of accessibility, stability, responsiveness. Like, does your digital estate respond? Is it easy to engage with? Is it quick? So.
And I think what this tells us, so Live West Homes Limited, great. You come top on technical. So that means you've probably got a new website. It's been really well built. It's really snappy. You haven't got any issues with load times, responsiveness, how it performs on mobile. So maybe with you guys, we now need to have a conversation about some of the other aspects, because that is, so it's great to have that, and it should be the basis of all digital engagement, is that you've got a technically robust platform for mobile and desktop.
Yeah, I think so. I think, some of those things really should be given, things around accessibility. Like, if that's not part of the strategy, it kind of needs to be. But I think the other bit that is interesting on technical, and we might come onto it in a little bit, is this notion between the digital experience, which is both logged in and logged out. And I think a lot of this is looking at the kind of logged out experience, but you also need to understand how accessible things like the portals are, how rapidly. I think some of the stuff around kind of performance systems is very much based on, there's a lot of legacy platforms. There's a few core HMS systems that people are using that don't necessarily give you the best layer to talk to tenants. So again, there's an area there where technical has a big part in understanding, okay, what do we need to do potentially to overhaul some of that, and to make sure, it's not about using the most cutting edge technology. As I said before, it's about simplifying and bringing the best experience to the fore. So I think that's the area in technical that's interesting when you deep dive into individual organizations again.
And then that also then lends itself into sort of the engagement areas. And I think for us, sort of engagement obviously sits around things like website traffic, length of time on site, bounce rate. What I would say is that is underpinned, you talked about sort of technical being a foundational element, but that's a large part of this. For example, I think we've said previously, it's like, if Google's measures like 2.5 seconds is the time that most people would expect in terms of load speed. If you're not hitting that, it becomes much harder to engage, because people inevitably are going to switch off or look at alternatives and think there's an issue.
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned accessibility. I mean, accessibility could be a technical metric, and it is a technical metric, but it tends to be that an accessible website is a very well-built website. You need to think about language, you need to think about grabbing people's attention, simplicity, all of these things impact engagement. But again, no surprises here that Birmingham City Council are leading the way on engagement because of the amount of website traffic that they've been getting. So, like I said, interesting year for them. So a lot of traffic, but also that it's showing that their website, people are spending time on the website, probably trying to find information. And, just hopping back to the previous slide, Birmingham's technical score is really low. So this kind of high level of engagement on a poor quality website probably isn't going to be the best strategy in the long run.
Yeah.
So, I think, when you see these big gaps, you're kind of going like, there's something not quite right there. But it can just indicate what's been going on in that area and what they've been having to deal with.
Yeah, but also I think for me gives clear direction on work-ons. You know,
Yeah.
for me, it highlights areas that work together and how you can potentially make those massive, significant steps forward as an organisation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the other thing, again, I know I keep saying when you look in isolation, but the other thing is, when we've got this data, we can segment down to the size of the association. So here, you're comparing the whole market.
Yeah.
But actually, Birmingham have a lot of people searching for them that will be driving a lot of traffic. But actually, when you compare that with someone else that might say have sub 5,000 properties within their kind of their portfolio, what does that look like as a measure when you compare M-MeX as well? And it gives you a view kind of in the peer set of how that looks and what you can do.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important piece, isn't it, Dan? Because I think a lot of people would go, right, okay, well, where's the competition? Where does it sit, etc.? Who do we benchmark against? And I think it's so important to consider scale as part of this. If you're sort of less than 5,000 homes, it's a very different organisation to somebody who's managing, for example, more than 40,000 homes. And I think on this slide, we sort of provide that summary, don't we? And again, I think that's one of the benefits of M-MeX is it allows us to make sure that you can sort of benchmark against organisations that are operationally, scale-wise, are in your sort of ballpark.
Yeah, 100%. And, we have the ability to compare, like for like peers and understand, what are the strategies in certain areas and how does that impact them on the M-MeX score overall. So I think that's a key part to understand how it compares and something that I think would be useful for everyone to deep dive into how they perform and what their data looks like.
Yeah, and for me, what's interesting is, so these are in blue is the top performer across all the data points for that particular segment. So less than 5,000, 5 to 40,000, greater than 40,000. None of those blue hexagons is perfect by any means. They've all got some significant areas that they could improve on. But it just goes to show that. Even though we've, some of the ones that we've pulled out as we've gone through, like Birmingham, they aren't appearing in here because they're significantly down on some of the other metrics. So, well done to Hinckley, Bosworth, Stockport, Bromford. Bromford is one that does come up in conversation quite a lot. So good to see that they're kind of topping the list there. But as Dan said, we've got the lowdown on everyone in the sector, and I know that people within the sector do have their peers that they would like to compare to, and I think for me this gives a really, really interesting insight into what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that sort of leads on to sort of top 3 recommendations. I think a big part of what we've sort of built Mediaworks on is about sort of taking data and turning it into insight, but then also how do you turn that insight that we've produced as part of, for example, this white paper, as we've produced in terms of M-MeX, how do you actually then turn that into action? I think it's really important. So when we're thinking about these sort of top 3 recommendations, Dan, I think it's important, isn't it, that sort of all of these are consistent, iterative things that people need to be working on over a period of time. It's not a one and done approach.
No, 100%. And I think that goes back to the point earlier about all of this is the experience. It's about understanding how you communicate, but also listen. And use digital channels as a method to do that. And as before, a lot of it is just around reducing friction because of legacy systems and actually having a kind of layer that allows us to be easy for tenants to interact with and get what they need in the places where they want them to be. And obviously, as we're saying, M-MeX is a great way to kind of identify where they are and push those through. So that's kind of the area I think that is massively important. But it is a continual iteration of learn, test, and improve, rather than saying it's one and done.
Yeah. And I think, Dan, then when we come on to HomeLink, I think, again, we just wanted to showcase a project that we've been working on with a number of our partners.
Yeah, definitely. I think, again, it reinforces a lot of the points that I said earlier, but I think, we have a lot of legacy systems within the housing space that in some instances, they don't talk to one another, or the housing association doesn't necessarily have the budget to allow those to communicate together and give the tenants the best experience. I've talked to some local authorities that are still managing tickets in spreadsheets or have 2 or 3 portals that tenants have to log into. So what we've done over the last 12 months is built out the HomeLink platform, which is really a tenant-first portal. It aims to give you a best-in-class logged-in experience where, a lot of the website and budget has gone on the logged-out experience. and bring all this together to the forefront so that you really can simplify the services, things like key journeys around, rental payments, reporting repairs. It might be booking in gas or electric safety checks, having a check-in process with your housing officer. It's two other areas like onboarding. How do we make onboarding a much better experience, and how can the applicants have a process of being logged in ahead of any approvals on kind of the property. So HomeLink is a platform that we're pushing out there to essentially level the playing field for associations and local authorities. So it's not about having a big capital expenditure project. It's about a platform that you can get that aligns to your workflows, but does a lot of the heavy lifting as a kind of a SaaS-based platform.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a nice place to conclude the session, to be honest, Dan. I think hopefully what you've seen is that if anybody wants to find out any more about how we've approached the white paper from a housing perspective, I think, again, please do sort of get your copy. It's a fantastic document that we've produced. I think it sort of talks about those transformational aspects. It talks about how we've actually gone about in more detail, sort of those measures, what the data actually tells us. I think that's so important. Again, if you want that hard copy and you haven't had one, then by all means, just type into the chat and request one. We'll be more than happy to send one out. We can also send digital copies because, again, we've seen a lot of people want to speak to us about the information that's contained within this document. But again, it's a snapshot, right? This is a cross-sectional piece. For us, this becomes something that we iterate and has then more of a longitudinal piece in the coming months, years, etc., as we supplement the data that we're seeing in there. I think, again, if anybody wants to find out a bit more about their M-MeX activity, then by all means, please complete the form that's in the chat to request a complimentary M-MeX audit. We're more than happy to provide that with one of our experts in-house to come and talk to you about what that actually means for your specific organisation. Hopefully you've taken a lot of insight from the session. Hopefully it's been plenty of food for thought, and any future questions, then by all means reach out. But thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much, Paul, and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye.